I'm going to talk to, I think we have a theist who wants to talk to us here. We have John Paul, who's calling from Washington. John Paul, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Hey guys, how are you?
Doing great, thanks. How can we help?
Well, I was calling today just because, I've been reading The God Delusion from Richard Dawkins, and in it, he makes an interesting statement about how things look designed. And even though he has a but at the end of that, where he goes into an explanation of why he thinks things look designed, it is an interesting. Do you guys feel like things look designed? I guess I'll start with that because I don't want to try to impeach you with his words. You guys.
No, thanks for asking us first. Yeah, I think on a surface level, I think it's very easy to come to the conclusion that something looks designed. I think there's something intuitive about that conclusion. I don't necessarily think it's correct, right? But I do think it's an intuitive assumption. Would you say the same, Calvin?
Yeah, I mean, I would pretty much agree with that. That's pretty intuitive. I guess my question would be is, I guess what would be the argument on your end? Is what are you, I guess, kind of implying, John?
Well, even in a debate setting, right? If we're sitting here talking about if the theist has the proposition and the atheist is the opposition side, stating something, a commonality like things look designed, now shifts, I think, some of the burden to the atheist position in that they are making an affirmative defense. Now, having to state something, yes, we admit it looks designed, we admit with our counterpart, but now you have to prove it from A to Z. It's not all too dissimilar from, say, a defense attorney working against a criminal case where their client looks guilty. They admit, oh, they happen to be there at this time, and all these facts seem to be, agreed upon. But now we have to present this idea that, oh no, it looks this way, but it's not. And so I kind of find it interesting that the atheist position tries to always take the path of being in the position where the theist has to have the burden of proof. But in instance,
if I may interrupt you, John Paul, I think Richard Dawkins, to give him credit, I think makes a point in showing how some things look designed but actually aren't. If I recall, he gives the example that's often touted in the atheist community, because how often it's touted in the Christian community of the eye, right? The human eye, allegedly this extremely complex organ in its sensory functions, which we actually have a fairly competent idea of, in evolutionary terms, of how it became what it is in humans, not just in humans, but in other organisms as well, right? We can give you a timeline of the eye and its development in natural history. So I see your point in saying that we have to, maybe it's actually the atheist burden of proof to prove how it's not designed, but I think we actually can do that for many, many things. Can we explain everything, how everything's gotten to be right now in concrete, specific ways? Maybe not, but we've gotten a lot done in the field of evolutionary science in explaining how much of our bodies have come to the way that they are.
And I would agree that he does go into that issue of the eye. However, and I believe in evolution. I'm not an anti-evolutionist.
Sure.
However, where I think the problem comes into play is the innate systems. And you could start talking about it related to the constants of the universe. You could come all the way down here on Earth talking about the water system, the tectonic plates, the magnetic fields, all the things that make life possible on this Earth that are innate and don't have a developmental cycle. We don't look at Mars and go, oh, well, Mars has tectonic plates. We look at our moon and you can see real quickly in NASA, they're saying, well, there's not another example that they found in the entire universe that a moon that size is in its proximity to another planet. And the materials it's made up of are completely unique in that it's like a matte box finish designed for light. So I guess it's in the innate elements. So Dawkins does go into the biological, and in that I don't disagree with him. I'm not an advocate against evolution, but in all the circular system of the planet, the I can't even say the word. Hold on, hyaline system that regulates the Earth's the temperature, similar to an organic life form regulating temperature within itself. There's all these things that create circumstantial evidence, if you will, that start to overlay and create a case that could be beyond reasonable doubt insofar as it relates to a designer or a creator. Not, I think there's another step trying to say, oh, it's the Judaic God of the blah, 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 blah. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah,
but
I think kind of the thing is here, John, is that, John Paul, is that you're kind of presupposing that there had to be a creator, that you're presupposing that this is a design. And I don't come from that position, as Dan explained before, is that we have scientific processes that can explain how the planets work, how the solar system works, how, the moon looks the way it does, the way it moves it does, the tectonic plates. We have processes in place where we can describe how these things came to be to the best of our abilities. Can those opinions change? Yeah, but the evidence is on the side of, that this is how things are as far as we know.
Yeah.
And I don't see a reason to suppose that, there was a design, that specifically a god or a creator had anything to do with it. So I'm not really sure how you're reaching the conclusion that, it had to have been designed.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think maybe to John Paul's credit, and he would correct me if I'm wrong here, I think he's maybe making a more subtle argument to the idea that there are natural systems that we can explain how they work, but we don't know why they work, right? Like, why is gravity a thing? Why are these things there? That's not something that really science can answer, right? Because that's outside of the bounds of science. So there is a bit of a God of the gaps there, I think, right? Which is like, we have to, a God has to exist outside of what we could know. Because if we could know the answer to that question, then suddenly God, there's no room for him there, right? So I think there's always going to be room for a God in that sense. The question is that the most probable explanation, right? And I would say that, for example, you brought up the moon is a very interesting object of study, right? And NASA and other organizations have talked about this. The moon's kind of weird compared to other moons. It doesn't look and act like other moons. It's not made of the same kinds of things that we see in other moons, even in our solar system. And for the, there's a million different things that make the moon kind of interesting, right? But also people are kind of interesting, right? The fact that human beings are here, and it makes for sense to me that we would have one planet where all this weird stuff is happening, where it's not going to be typical across other planets. In fact, if we saw, for example, that there were other humans in other moons like ours and other Earths like ours, relatively similar to us in other places, that would actually maybe lead more credence to a God than not, because from what we know about the natural sciences, we're definitely an anomaly, so to speak, in some ways. So it kind of cuts both ways, right? I don't know. I think Calvin already kind of said it best here. How, if we can just as much presuppose a God as presuppose not a God, I suppose. But I think it comes down to probability. And you mentioned, of course, the Judeo-Christian God may not be the best explanation, and I would agree with you there. But why any God? Right? What kind of God would it be? Can we know anything about this God through his creation? And so far, I would say not really, other than he seems to make stuff and then kind of leave us be. And maybe that's the kind of God he is, but I don't know. That's a lot of thoughts there, John Paul. What do you think?
Well, I guess, and that's what I get from a lot of, because I am doing a lot of study right now, and I've been listening to a lot of these shows, and one of the things that I notice as a tendency is to compartmentalize the issue or bifurcate the issue and drill down on one thing, trying to say, as to your point, oh, well, we can explain how this works, and then we can theorize how it may have come to be. And I think that just like, and going back to my illustration of a defense attorney, if their client, who maybe is on trial for murder, has a bunch of circumstantial things that puts them in this place, gives them a reason, gives them all these things. I mean, at some point, the defense attorney is just their words are going to fall on deaf ears, in the sense that there's just too many things stacking up against the accumulation of the circumstantial evidence. And I guess what I'm seeing is that what I don't hear is a combined argument for all those things, because I could go on, as you probably know, which I won't do, I could probably go on for an hour talking about all the unique things that we see in this in our sphere that make it just perfect for us. And I'm not even talking, without even mentioning the constants that make all those other little things possible. And I guess there is an accumulated effect, I think, that's not discussed enough, maybe, that would make theism, you may not say on par with atheism, but I don't think it's as ridiculous as I think a lot of atheists make it. How about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's definitely something, yeah.
I think my response to that would be the problem with intelligent design arguments like this is that for every time that we can point to something that's mysterious and something that seems to correlate with our existence being here, there's also a lot of things that we can point to not, right? There are women dying every day from childbirth, right? Just from something that's supposed to be a natural thing that happens, right? I mean, we can talk about cancer, we can talk about, climate change actively wrecking our planet and destroying life as we know it. Or we can talk about how we live on a planet that's mostly made of seawater, which we can't drink and isn't healthy for us to consume, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that we can point to that actually are hostile to our existence. If we go anywhere outside of our atmosphere, we're cooked, we're toast. So we seem to be stuck on this rock unless we can change that in the future. I don't know, like I seem to be able to point for every point of evidence towards something being designed. There is something that's actively hostile to us. I had my appendix removed when I was 12. If I didn't, I would have probably died. Most cases of appendicitis that aren't treated either result in death or lifelong injury. There's pretty much no getting away from that, right? And I didn't do anything. As far as I know, my appendix just kind of ruptured one day. It seems to be not a great design on some point, right? So that's the kind of the problems with these intelligent design things. It's like, yeah, we can talk about some cool stuff. We can talk about some terrible stuff that doesn't actually alleviate to a good thing for us to be, right? But anyway, what are your thoughts there, John Paul?
And I've heard that statement too, and I've had to connect with that in the sense that if the objective is that human life and life in general is successful on the earth, that check mark is checked, regardless of all those things you just mentioned.
Sure.
Meaning humans are remarkably successful on the earth, so it's good enough for that, if that's the objective. And yes, they're on an individual basis and circumstantial individuals that have, my wife has multiple sclerosis, talk about bad fortune. There are those cases. I'm not doubting that, but the overall goal has been met. That's what I would say. Meaning if I was going to start an ant farm and my goal was to have 1,000 ants, and 50 of them died, or whatever percentage. I'm just trying to make an illustration. But I had a successful ant farm. I guess at the end of the day, it was a success.
But John Paul, if you could stop those ants from dying on your ant farm, wouldn't you do that?
Well, now we're getting into the morality of whatever created.
Sure, but I'm saying, what does this say about our God, right? Maybe there is a God, but it doesn't seem like he has our best interests in mind. Maybe he has some interests, but not all of our interests, because he's definitely okay with children dying, right, of terrible, terrible things. He's definitely okay with some people suffering. So on some level, yes, I agree with you. If the objective is human flourishment, then yeah, there's some checkboxes that are being made, but not all of them. And that's kind of critical, actually, because if he is a God who can do anything, there shouldn't be any limitations to that, right? So that kind of, I don't know. I don't think it helps the intelligent design aspect of it, because a good intelligent designer would design for these other things. If we lived in a world, for example, John Paul, right, where 1 in 50 of us who are born with our heads on fire, okay, we would say that's not a good thing. Would that help us in understanding that there's an intelligent designer? I don't think so. We don't live in that world, but we do live in a world where people are born with genetic illnesses. We're born with Harlequin babies, all kinds of awful, awful stuff, and it just happens. And I don't know. I think, again, you're using a court analogy here, but I think there's some counter evidence here that we need to look at, to where I don't think a God would even remotely be interested in a design like that. And if he is interested, then we can't possibly know his motivations and can't possibly know, how he did any of this or what he's up to, right?
Yeah, I mean, but to answer that, I'd have to go into the theology side, I suppose.
Sure. But shouldn't we be able to prove a God in the first place, right? Without motivations? I don't know.
If, motivations. I think the personality of the God is a separate thing, but I would say if you're talking about the Judaic God of Yahweh, let's just say Jesus later.
Yeah.
If you were to really read the Bible the way that, the end result is everybody is resurrected or lives again. The suffering still remains the same. It's temporal, but then ultimately the end conclusion of the Bible is that everybody won't be suffering. And it's explicit in that. So it's not like to your equity issue, all that gets corrected. I mean, even look at Psalms 82, which goes into great length of Yahweh decrying the injustice of suffering and all that. I mean, there does seem to be, and again, that's if Yahweh.
The problem is,
the thing is with this, John Paul,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Calvin.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
I think the bottom line is it kind of comes down to, the Bible says so. Like why would you believe that the way that the Bible describes hell, or that there even is a hell to begin with, when there's other religions that, don't describe a hell whatsoever. It comes down to, you're kind of picking and choosing what doctrines to follow, and, what gods you may or may not believe in. And I don't think we've even really touched on exactly like what God you necessarily believe in, because you've told us a lot of things about God that you don't necessarily believe. But I understand that you're a theist and such, but I don't really know if I've really gotten a good characteristic as to what you think God is, whether he exists, what evidences there is for him, other than things look designed. So it's like, regardless of the morality of God, I couldn't care less about what God likes or doesn't like until we demonstrate whether that God exists whatsoever. And that's, again, kind of piggybacking off of Dan.
Yeah, and to bolster Calvin's point, John Paul, like, what if I said, well, there's actually two creators. There's a creator that makes humans, and then there's a creator that makes everything else. Or there's a creator that makes water, and there's a creator that makes the earth. That's going to be substantially different from an intelligent design claim that says there's only going to be one creator, right? How could we even show that there's going to be two or three or multiple creators? What if there's competing forces? That might explain a lot of things, right? Maybe there's some people who are competing to create some good things for us and then some bad things for us, right? Like, to me, all of these are kind of indefensible, because we are starting with, again, as Calvin put it towards the beginning, I think a presupposition there, a motivation that's saying, hey, there has to be some sort of divine entity that's doing all of this. I just don't see that we have to even start with that assumption. Right. I don't think the assumption makes any more explanatory power towards the things that we're seeing than the absence of a God. But you might disagree with me.
Yeah. What I would say what you said that I agree with a twist is that it does seem that regardless of what God you choose that's been, here on earth, they all start from a position that gods exist. So it's basically every textbook is theist written every textbook isn't written to prove the existence of God. It's designed to speak to existing theists. And if you're a theist believing in this God's not right, come over to this side of the equation, and this God is the truth. There doesn't seem to be any religious texts that, for instance, start from the baseline, apart from, I suppose, Genesis slightly, but even that has its own issues.
Sure.
But I guess where my initial call was related to just theism in general, a creator, a designer, things look designed. There is, and again, I'm still on a search myself. So, I'm just calling in.
And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us on the show. That's really meaningful, because that means that you at least trusted our opinion, or at least respected it enough to want to know our takes, or maybe not. Maybe you just wanted to see us flub or something. I don't know. Whatever, regardless of your motivations, I do appreciate you calling in, because it's a great subject to talk about.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah. And
all right, John Paul.
I know you guys probably have other callers, so. Yep.
We do have some other callers, so I am going to let you go now. But thanks so much, John Paul, for calling in.
Thank you, John Paul.